Welcome to our second lecture on monopolies. As we saw in our last lecture, monopolies are um, a market structure in which we have one producer and barriers to entry. Now, we assume that the monopolist will use their power to attempt to control the market. And what they're going to want to do is to keep the price of their product as high as they possibly can. They do that by keeping the supply of their product low. Now, we know that in the United States, monopolies have been illegal since the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. The Sherman Antitrust Act is very important because it made it illegal to restrict the free trade of a good. Right, so first of all, that was very important. Secondly, it was important because it was the first attempt by the government to regulate big business. Up to this point, there hadn't been big businesses, so this was a very important piece of legislation. But now, how do we think about monopolies? What are monopolies going to do? Well, in our last lecture, we realized that monopolies, just like a perfectly competitive firm, are going to want to maximize their profit. And so we assumed that profit maximization meant that the firm was going to produce at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And now, since they can set the price, they're going to go up to the demand curve and over, and they're going to set the price at that point. Now, our gut reaction is that this is going to be bad. This price is going to be too high. This output is going to be too low. But what can we do about it? Well, if a monopoly exists in the United States, it is regulated by the federal government. For example, the U.S. Postal Service is a monopoly in the delivery of first-class mail. So the government tells the Postal Service what they can charge for a stamp, first-class stamp, and how much delivery they need to do, all sorts of things. Let's assume that you've been asked to join the regulatory body that's going to oversee a monopoly. You and the board are going to want to set the price of the good lower than what it would be here under the monopoly, and thus set the output higher. But how do you determine where that price and quantity should be? Well, the only information that you have is the information the monopolist is going to give you. It's this information we're seeing on the screen right now. But you really want the firm to produce closer to what a perfectly competitive firm would be doing and charge the price as close to a perfectly competitive price as possible. But you don't have that information. We're stuck with this downward sloping demand curve, this separate marginal revenue curve. We don't know what to do. So what we can do is to pretend that if you look here, we're now indicating that demand and marginal revenue are the same. That's what we know happens under a perfectly competitive firm. So now if you profit maximize at the point where demand equals marginal revenue equals marginal cost right here, you now can get a quantity that is close to perfectly competitive as possible and a price as close to perfectly competitive as possible. Although we realize these are not the true prices and quantities that will occur under perfect competition, what we can see is that we've gotten better. We're producing more at a lower price. So then this is a great way of getting closer to what perfect competition would be. There is something else. There's another problem with monopolies that we haven't looked at so far, and that is called consumer welfare. Now, consumer welfare is defined as the difference between what you're willing to pay and what you have to pay. For example, if you go to the store to buy a new computer, you think you're going to spend, you're willing to spend $2,000. Let's pick an outrageous number, $2,000. But you get to the store and you realize you only have to pay $500. So you were thinking before that this computer was going to give you $2,000 worth of utility, but now you only have to fork over $500. So you're getting a lot of utility, $2,000 worth of utility, for only $500. This is a great bargain, hence why we like sales. All right, now, in order for us to determine the consumer welfare under perfect competition and under monopoly, we need to use a tool called price discrimination. This is tricky. Price discrimination is charging different people different prices for the same good. Price discrimination is also illegal, both under the Sherman Antitrust Act and under the Clayton Act of 1914. Now, we see price discrimination, or what we think is price discrimination, frequently. For example, go drive on the turnpike and try to get gas on the turnpike. It's going to be really expensive. But that's not price discrimination. That's supply and demand. People don't want to get off the turnpike, so they can charge more for gas. Price discrimination would be if you and I each went into our local grocery store to buy a gallon of milk. If they charge you $2 for the gallon of milk, I'm right behind you getting a similar gallon of milk, and they charge me $5. That's price discrimination. That is illegal. Now, if a firm wanted to price discriminate, they'd have to have three things have to occur in order to be able to price discriminate. The first is that they have to be a price setter. They have to control the price. Secondly, they'd have to know who's willing to pay more and who isn't. Maybe by zip codes if you're sending out catalogs, or if you think you're in a ritzy neighborhood, maybe people are willing to pay more. Also, you have to keep those people you think are willing to pay more ignorant of the fact that there's some place to buy it for less. You don't want them driving to the neighboring town because you can buy the good for less. All right. Now, this price discrimination, we use this as a tool to look at what people are willing to pay. Now, I want to warn you, the next slide is a little scary because it's got a lot of stuff in it. So don't freak out when you see it, but let's look at the next slide. All right. Now, let me expand our view here. All right. Now, all right. In this graph, and please, I know this is being cut off here a little bit. This is our price, or measuring price here. This is basically the same graph I just showed you, but with lots more stuff in it. All right. Now, if we were to price discriminate, that would simply mean we were charging every consumer the maximum amount they would be willing to pay. So for the first unit of the good, we'd start for number 1, go all the way up here, they'd be willing to pay that much. For the second unit, which would be here, we'd go up. And so really all of the area underneath the demand curve and the quantity is how much a consumer is willing to pay. So in the case of a monopoly, areas 1, 2, and 4 here, the area bounded by the demand curve and quantity, represent what the consumer is willing to pay if we could price discriminate. Now, we know we can't price discriminate. It's illegal, it's unethical, it's a lot of things. But let's look. How much must you pay? Well, if we're charging everyone the same price under a monopoly, this would be the price. And so what we have to pay is areas 2 and 4. So the difference between what you're willing to pay, areas 1, 2, and 4, and what you must pay, areas 2 and 4, is area 1. So consumer welfare under monopoly will be area 1. If we do the same analysis for perfect competition, we would see the amount you're willing to pay using price discrimination would be all 5 areas: the area bounded by the demand curve, the quantity at perfect competition, and the axes. So areas 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 represent what you are willing to pay under perfect competition. But again, we cannot price discriminate. And so we have to charge everyone the same price, which is PPC here. And so areas 4 and 5 represent what you must pay under perfect competition. The difference between what you're willing to pay, areas 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, minus what you must pay, areas 4 and 5, is the consumer welfare under perfect competition, which is this large triangle up here, areas 1, 2, and 3. So we can see that consumer welfare under monopoly, area 1, is much smaller than consumer welfare under perfect competition, which is areas 1, 2, and 3. Now, that's great, except we notice that under monopoly, who gets area 2? Area 2 is what consumers will pay, and so it at least gets created under monopoly. It goes to the producer under monopoly, but area 2 does get created. Society gets it. It's this little triangle here, area 3, that presents a real issue to us when we're looking at consumer welfare. Under perfect competition, area 3 goes to consumers. But under monopoly, who gets it? Well, that's a trick question, because we know if we look at quantities down here, the monopolist stops producing at QM. So area 3 doesn't get created. So from an economist's perspective, we say that consumer welfare, consumers are much better off under monopoly, and society is better off because we get more consumer welfare. All right, take a few moments, look at this chart, puzzle it out. If you have any questions, let me know.